Hello, my name is Andrew Penner, and I'm the president of the AEE Canada East chapter. And this morning, we're bringing you a webinar on the evolution of smart building optimization. I'm going to pass the show on to Mark Bassini, and he's going to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Andrew. Pleasure to be here today. We have Paul Palat from Johnson Controls. Paul's an experienced and enthusiastic individual with a demonstrated sales experience and customer account history. Paul started in the industry in 1992 as a service tech, and he's been part of the JCI team since February 2020. Paul's presently the director of sales for digital in Canada, and he's responsible for working with our sales team to implement digital sales solutions to help customers attain their operations and sustainability targets. And Paul's been a sales professional for the better part of the last 2 decades in both the owner and construction sides of the business. He has an extensive background working in numerous environments, including smart buildings, building automation, green buildings, labs, energy management, HVAC, and the digital world, of course. His experience includes working in the service, construction, and energy markets with federal government, healthcare, education, commercial industrial labs, and pharmaceutical markets. So I'll hand it off to Paul to introduce the main event today, which is the evolution of smart building optimization.
Good morning. Hopefully everyone can see what I'm presenting now. First off, thanks for having me. As Mark mentioned, I've been around for a little while, so that introduction always makes me feel a little old. So without further ado, I'll dive right into this. So if you take a look at what's been driving digital.
Paul, you still need to get your screen share up.
Oh, sorry, it was showing. My apologies.
Sorry.
You should be able to see it there now.
Yeah, we're ready to go.
We're good. My apologies. So when you think of digital, one of the things we have to consider is like, what are the factors? What are the things that are driving digital? So if we were to take a look at buildings that were constructed before 2000, and you got rid of all the buildings before 2000 in Canada, what we'd have is cities with little spikes. There wouldn't be a whole lot of buildings going on. And really, they were built for a different purpose. They were just built for putting people in, maintaining temperature, a lot of them temperature and humidity. And then we started introducing, let's get into energy reduction. Like, the provinces didn't have enough power. So we were going from incandescent lights to fluorescent and LED. And then we moved over to overall, like, let's keep that energy spend down. But then 5 years ago, a couple years before COVID, we started changing even how we were looking at things at that point. It wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was about CO2. It was about getting back off gas. We went from electricity to gas. Now it's like, let's go back to gas, to electricity, just so we can get those emissions down. And then we introduced that hybrid workspace. That was really the first time we were starting to see that moving around. And now when you look at what these buildings are faced with and what these building owners are faced with, it's getting crazy. It's about cost per person, and realistically, sustainability is now the word that encompasses all 5 of the previous boxes. We're not seeing temperature control. We're not seeing energy control. It's just sustainability. Indoor air quality is huge, obviously. Carbon tax, don't really need to say much about that. If you're not familiar with how effective some carbon tax has overall, like if everybody hears about it, but maybe you haven't heard exactly how much of an effect it has. There's a hospital in Northern Ontario, 686,000 square feet. Last year, they had to pay $500,000 in carbon tax. There's a university in Toronto, paid $25 million in carbon tax. That's all stuff they haven't budgeted for, but it's affecting how they do things. The spatial experience. People are, when they come into work, they don't want to just come into a cube. They don't want to come into a basic environment anymore. They want it to feel like an invigorating space. Physical and mental wellness, absolutely. Like, everyone is working a lot. There's a lot of focus on making sure people have what they need, are working effectively. But there's not too many people that I hear that are saying, yeah, I don't have anything to do. Biophilia. 5 years ago, if you looked on the walls, it was nothing but team pictures. Like everyone has seen that rowing picture, like a team working together. Now it's plants, animals, trees. It's bringing the outdoors in, just making it feel like a much more inviting space. Risk management, cross contamination. We all know the effects of COVID, and probably the biggest part though is labor shortages and attrition. There's not too many people that are in any roles that are of 5, 10, 15 years. So I've been with JCI for 4 years. Previous to that, I was with Siemens for 27 years. People being with any company for in excess of 20 years moving forward is going to be beyond rare. It just isn't going to be part of that reality. And when you start looking at cybersecurity as a whole, it's the effect it's having on trying to collect data or get data or even just get into a corporation's network is becoming a challenge. And then there's another term that I haven't put on here because it's one that I just heard recently, and I'm trying to get my head around a little bit, but it's called peopling. And peopling is people have been working at home for 3 years, majority, and now they come back into the work environment, and it's almost like a social awkwardness that's happening. So some introverts have become extroverts, and extroverts have become introverts. Like it's just been a complete change in the way that people are interacting with each other. Moore's law. Moore's law says technology is going to double every year, and that's really what's been happening. No question. Like things are accelerating, and they're accelerating quickly, and we have a lot of people faces that people recognize that are really key people behind this. When you look at the phone industry as a whole, it's a great example of exactly how technology has followed that Moore's law curve. In the 60s through the 80s, not a whole lot changed. Like as much as we went from a phone you picked up, it was still just a phone. The 90s, it was a phone. We started introducing some texting in 2000, but then that BlackBerry and the PDAs that we see now went into a whole different level. When you look at the bottom, building automation in the 80s and 90s, I can remember in the 90s when I first started as a tech, I'd write a program so that a pump would sequence on and off, and guys would literally clap their hands and go like, "Oh, that's just cool." Then we got into the 2010s, and we do setbacks on energy, like just one click, and every return air temperature was reset. Fantastic again. Now we get into the cognitive building. You walk into the space, the building knows you're there, it does stuff. When you leave the space, it knows you left, it does other stuff. That's just at a whole different level, but it comes with its own challenges. When you look at the actual buildings themselves, if we look across Canada, we have some beautiful cities. Challenge that these cities are facing right now is building occupancy, hybrid workplaces, retiring, baby boomers, all that sort of stuff. So as much as lease rates show, we should still have really good occupancy. We all know that if you actually go to buildings, they're empty. Like 20% occupancy is not unusual across the board. So now what's happening is as leases come up and it's time to renew, there's different considerations that are coming into play. People are looking at what's my overall intensity, or they're looking at overall, like how many people do I have going into that space? Do I need to lease the same amount of space? And that has a lot of folks really concerned. When you look at the labor shortage statistics from StatsCan, there's a lot of things that we never really would have thought of or encountered in 10 years ago. As you can see, like 2016, things were doing well for labor. But when you start looking at all the jobs that are booked in Canada right now, there's well over 40% of the jobs booked that are short on labor. Like there's just not enough people to actually execute what's actually already in the queue. Forget what's coming. And then when you take a look at, okay, when are we going to recover? So if we're sitting at this 20, like as much as it's supposed to be, I'll say baby boomers should not be retiring quite so quickly. We all know that COVID caused some people to retire faster, all that sort of stuff. So we're moving along this curve little more aggressively than anticipated. But the scary part is it's not suggesting we're going to catch up until 2031, 2032, something like that effect. Well, that means we're into this low labor shortage aspect for at least another 5-7 years. That's a lot, and there's a lot to do in that time. When you start looking at the number of people who it used to be a very candid thing. If you were looking for a job, no one knew. Now people are openly saying, like, yeah, I'm looking at moving over here, and it's part of a job escalation methodology. So people are moving, they go to another company so that they can come back to that company or go somewhere else to work their way up through the ladder. There's uh, this great resignation thing started in the States about a year and a half ago, and people are literally quitting and saying, okay, I'm available for hire before they get home. They have jobs. Like it's pretty crazy. But the craziest one for us in Canada is this comes from Immigration Canada, and it's basically saying if you come to Canada, you'll have a job. Our challenge is there's no place for these people to live. So, like the province of Ontario, for instance, just this past September, Doug Ford announced that every municipality in Ontario has to carry 5% of their budget for low-cost housing. Like that's how desperate we're getting to try and bring people in to fill in some of these gaps. So we have to start doing things differently. So one of the things that we're starting to do differently is how we purchase products, how customers are going to the market. So obviously for decades, it's been the capital funding model. So we just go in, you have so much money, you pay for this project, you do change orders, typical deal. The private public partnership, where somebody, the GC takes ownership of the building for 30 years, is responsible for the maintenance, energy savings, for example, and some other metrics. So that was a popular thing, I'll say 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It slowed down, starting to come back now. We're starting to see more and more requests coming out because of the labor shortages and the challenges with the technical workforce. The energy service companies, ESCOs, they've been around for quite some time, the sustainable infrastructure companies. And this is probably becoming one of the most popular go-tos because they have access to money. The methodology is opening up money within an operating budget. And the Canadian Infrastructure Bank has hopped on to a lot of these companies. So it's like the bank is actually trying to find low cost financing means for owners and everything that affect. When you look at integrated project delivery, that's where you do the full building information modeling. Before you make the project, you select your entire team. Everybody has their 2 cents that comes in. There's a number of them going on across Canada, but it's not taking off maybe as much as some people anticipated because it's a big initial investment on the customer's behalf, and not everyone's ready to go that far. You'll probably see them just strictly on greenfields, obviously. I haven't seen a brownfield yet, but I'm sure we will at some point. Subscription as a service. The simplest way I like to explain this one is Microsoft Office. A few years back, it wasn't unusual. Well, maybe 5-7 years back, a little more than 3 years. It wasn't unusual if you wanted to open a Word document you received from somebody else. All of a sudden, it wasn't compatible, and what was basically happening is they had a different version than you did, and in the end, it really made a difference with regards to who could see what and everything. So now if you look, everybody just gets a software subscription. And with that subscription, everyone's at the same level. And now Microsoft isn't looking at different versions and backing up and everything. They just keep moving on. That's the typical environment we see as we move forward. So people are moving more into this aspect. And what it also does is it gives more of a cost per person sort of approach. So who can see this aspect of what I'm purchasing? The other thing that does is it moves things from a bit of a capital budget over to an operating budget. So it becomes much more of a controlled environment. Around the 1900s, we had this great thing called the industrial evolution, in which case a whole bunch of tiers came out. Everybody took their piece of the pie and said, okay, this is my field of expertise. And then what did we do about five years ago? We started introducing the smart building technology stuff that really doesn't care where things come from. So when you look at a smart building, there's a lot of things that can happen in that smart building over a very short period. And when you think of, like, if I walked into a meeting room and I want the lights to come on, the blinds to operate, and the temperature to change, I've affected every construction tier on the screen except fire. But when we procure them, we're not considering that. Everyone has their own silo. So as a result, right now in the market, it's becoming a bit of a square peg with a round hole, if you will. The other challenge that's really been becoming more and more apparent as things go. If you think of my Moore's technology slide, where technology is doubling at Moore's law, the technology is doubling every year. There's a lot of folks, like with procurement, it's just been like, get things out as hard and fast as you can. The only time a lot of consultants have are, as you all well know, is a copy paste environment. Like, realistically, like some of these procurement jobs are a fifth the cost of what they were 10 years ago. So now you have to try to accomplish the same amount with very little time and resource and stuff. So what's happening is it's been making it, the working environment is making it very hard for people to keep up. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to move forward. And I like to say there's like a bit of a game that's started, if you will, and it's no one's fault. So if an architect was to talk to a general contractor and say, like, what's your digital experience, the GC is not going to say I don't know anything about it. They're going to suggest they know something about it, but the more you dig into it, they go probably from a little green to a little more red. Consultants, engineers, you guys are in tough spots. You've been asked to do a lot as a whole, so you're not going to say, I'm going to not say to a GC that I don't know what's happening, but I'm sure deep down in your hearts, there's a little number of you that are going, oh, this digital stuff is killing me. I've got a lot to learn. And then also when we introduce this customer role, so instead of it being project centric, all of a sudden with 2030 goals, 2050 goals, all these companies are saying, hey, you know what? We need to have somebody on our staff who can manage our interests and what we're looking for. There are so many sustainability people in these owner roles and stuff now that they have been in that role for 4 months, 5 months, 18 months, and they have a whole host of things that they have to bring in. And most sustainability folks that I've spoke to are generally overwhelmed. So there's a lot for them to take on. And there's a lot of pressure from that infamous C-suite, because it could be the difference of their business being here or not being here. So I come back to that square peg in a round hole. So we have to look at changing things, because we're not just looking at what's happening on the insides of buildings anymore. We've been looking at that for the last 40, 50 years. Like, we've really been trying to improve things. There's a lot of things we can do. But now what's happened is we have to look at the outside as well, like whether it's stadiums and public venue areas, malls, you name it. If you get into schools, some schools are looking to manage, like, how many kids are in the yard, that sort of stuff, everything. So it's getting really, really complicated for owners and operators. But this is probably the biggest complication of the bunch, is where the technology resides now. So for the last 30 years, if there was something within a building, it was in this red box. That facility director, when I started in the early 90s, could easily sign for a couple $1,000,000. Now they're lucky if they can sign for $25,000, because it's got a good procurement, that sort of aspect. But now all of a sudden, there's a lot of other folks that are involved, and they're involved at a whole different level, in that everyone has their own direction and their own part of the package. But really what's happening within the digital and the technological world is we're introducing players that haven't been considered part of the overall game to the same level, and that's the visitors, employees. Everyone is involved. So it's really making it tough, because, like, how do you involve? Like, it was already challenged to make things move forward with the red box, and now you introduce the blue box, and there's a lot of people. So it gets tough really quickly. So when you look at building standards, we've been working our way towards sustainability slowly but surely. And I'm gonna give a kind of a different example. So the Canadian military, what they basically say is you have to cut your hair a certain way, trim your beards, all that stuff. You have to fit their equipment. But we know that buildings are designed to be different. And as a result, there's all kinds of standards that have come out over the years to try and get these buildings, as much as they're different, to sort of be in a sustainable fashion, in same sort of methodology. So it's like if we can hit that sustainability level, we're moving in the right direction. Well, obviously, carbon neutral, carbon taxes, net zero, that's putting us into a different realm. Well, how do we do this? Like, what are we trying to satisfy? If we try to satisfy the infectious disease, like the COVID aspect of things, apologies, there are consequences. Like our occupancy health is going to go up, but our costs are going to go up as well. Our asset life is going to go down because everything's going to have to work harder to bring in fresh air, unless we're completely doing greenfield or putting new equipment in. Our equipment downtime, because it's working harder, is going to go up. Our return on investment it's going to be okay, but we're not going to get the best returns because everything's working a little harder and we're bringing more air in. Energy consumption obviously goes up. Certifications, we're bringing more air in. LEED, well, all those folks love air. But getting to like net zero, obviously you're bringing more fresh air in Canada. Right now we're using a lot of gas and electricity heat, and if we were 100% clean with electricity, maybe we could get there, but we're not there yet. Or if we go the other way, we're going to see occupant health. Like we can save energy, but the occupant health is going to be where we're used to now. It's like you may walk into a spot and there's smells that are in there versus that airy infectious control mode. Operational costs will definitely go down as life goes up. Equipment downtime, it's gonna be lower because things aren't working as hard. We're gonna have a better investment. Our consumption goes down. Our certifications are going to get a little tougher because there's not maybe quite as much fresh air coming in. And when it comes to getting to our net zero goals, like if we're bringing less fresh air in and we're doing that stuff, well, we're going to have a better chance of getting that net zero. But it's not really going as we anticipated. And the question becomes like, well, why not? During COVID, there's a lot of customers got surveyed asking like, what's happening? And I'm from the Ottawa area here, and if I think of all the customers I was dealing with in March of 2020, it was like, oh yeah, we're going to do all kinds of work. We're going to move ahead. We're going to do things. And by the end of March, we started early March. By the time we got into, I'll say May, those projects weren't coming to fruition. And what was basically happening is people started realizing is, even though my buildings are empty, my costs aren't going down. I can't control my lights. My temperatures are like there's nobody in the building, but I'm still running at the same temperature as though somebody's there. And when you start looking at these statistics, this is not what anyone anticipated. Because realistically, until COVID, we've never had the buildings emptied other than the Christmas or weekends, that sort of stuff, but they're all scheduled. But for the non-scheduled stuff, we've never had that before. So it really tells us that there's a ways we have to go. So one of the things that we were doing regularly is if you wanted to reduce your overall energy consumption, you just put something that was rated with a better rating as a whole. But for the last 20 years, we've been putting in things that are 80% efficient. So if we get to 90% efficient, we're not going to get to that net zero track or the energy efficiency move. Like it's not like when we went from that 60% efficient boiler to the 80%, like 20% had a big difference. 4 or 5% isn't making the effect we're looking at now. When you look at chillers and stuff, like the average chiller plant and stuff, the overall efficiencies are getting higher and higher because of the nature of where they're at. There's still some that have a ways to go. My apologies for the barking dog. And then when it comes to VFDs and stuff, There's been so many places that have already put these things in. So as a result, like what do we do? How do we move forward? First off, we have to look at our spaces differently. This slide always makes me feel like I've spent the first 30 years of my career looking at the wrong spots because we were focused on this operational cost. But realistically, like if we can't get people in the building, there's no purpose to the building. And when you start seeing stats like this, like 92% of the overall operation of the building is the people. With hospitals, in some cases, it gets even a little higher. Manufacturing plants gets a little lower. You might see more like 70, 75%, but it's still like the people effect has a huge amount. So we have to figure out how to get people back in that building. But we also have to consider what makes up the demographics of the people that are there. So when you start looking at like who's in the space, one of the things that stands out is this is the first time in history we've had 5 different demographics within a workspace to the level that we have. Like in past, once people were in their 60s, like between overall health and life expiry, um, they just weren't part of things. But now we have people that are in their 80s on, especially education and healthcare, that are they're still on executive boards or board of governors, that sort of stuff. And then we have students that in the Generation Z that are in the workplace as well. And what I like to do is sort of reset and get people thinking differently about how everyone looks at things. So when you're thinking of how do I communicate and talk to everybody in this space, who needs to see what, we need to consider like, well, how do they look at it? So everyone's familiar with cars. So maturists would look at a car like it was something I just didn't have to feed hay. I could get from A to B a little more reliably, or as long as the roads let me do that. But it was a neat thing to have. Then we come in with the baby boomers, hard, fast, straight line, not real good at corners. Gen X, not a lot more horsepower, but all of a sudden it was a little more weaving and bobbing, and it was like, okay, well we're gonna not just run down this hard straight path. We're gonna start looking at other things, like maybe what we're doing isn't quite working as we anticipated. You get into Gen Y, and now it's just, you know what, they're not really considering what happened with baby boomers and maturists. They're looking at today, at tomorrow. They're getting there hard and fast. They're making the corners. They're making the changes. But then you bring in this Generation Z, and it's a completely different level. Like, 1800 horsepower going forward to 5400 horsepower. Like their world is technology. Some people say that the generation's entitled. No, they're just the benefactors of the previous 4 generations creating technology. And it's to the point that they're not even working with the same starting point. Like, here we are, internal combustion, and now majority of these kids are going to be driving hybrids or EV vehicles. Driving a standard is not something they'll ever experience. When you look at the spaces, maturists, it was like a bunch of mice in a room. They were the machines. They were, you came into work, you passed paper, you did all that stuff. Then all of a sudden, within the 60s, everyone wanted their individual spaces. And then we got into that cube environment of Gen X. That's where I can remember poking my head over the top, see who's still here, that sort of stuff. And then Gen Y, the hybrid work environment, all of a sudden it was like, well, am I better off to work at home? Am I more effective? I can look family life, that sort of combination back and forth. But then we get into this next generation that they're just going, well, why do I even leave the house? So all of a sudden we have to satisfy a whole bunch of different audiences. And the biggest challenge is we don't know what we don't know in the buildings. Anyone who's worked on an existing building, if you say, can you give me your plans and specs, or give me your as-builts, and you're expecting a folder that's 4 inches thick, and they give you 3 sheets of paper and go, that's all we have, and it's outdated by 30 years. So most building owners are even struggling to find, like, to know what they have. So when we come in and we say, okay, we need to know more, we really need to know more before we can digitalize that workspace, before we can start to take in all the information and make changes. So digital is a 4-step process. You're not going to actually come in and just make something digital. First off, it's introduction, 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 use case. So typically you start out with facilities, maybe something for sustainability, you have that conversation, and then you have another conversation. They bring in IT, they bring in HR. Then that third conversation, there's sometimes just 20, 25, 30 people on the call. And what you're trying to do is get down to that use case. But the reality is, for most, it goes fire hose, garden hose, tap, glass of water. It's an overwhelming amount of information because most people have to consider something that's not within their domain now, and they have to look at what other people are doing, and that's not a comfort zone for a lot of folks. So how do we make this happen? Let's just pretend like we're at home. If you have any smart devices, I'm sure a lot of you right now are thinking like, well, I have this, this, and this. If I asked you how many people have smart devices, I'm sure 90% of you would put up your hands. If I asked you how many people had smart devices 7 years ago, we hear crickets. And that's the same sort of approach you need to take with buildings. Like, we're not just going to make it digital unless it's a greenfield and it's part of the spec. We really have to take a systematic approach. So if you think of what we did at home, like you had your traditional on-off switch, then you moved to a timer, and that was great. That was like the Home Alone series. But then it eventually got to the point where technology caught up and allowed us to do things at home that we've never been able to do. We had smart switches, smart plugs, and all of a sudden we can control lights. And you just add lights and add lights and add lights and add lights. And then you start getting into other smart devices. A lot of folks, smart thermostats. Suddenly, whether it was Nest or Ecobee, all that sort of stuff, everybody was jumping onto the smart thermostat. The fact that the province was giving credits back, and they'd give you the stat to help them reduce their overall cost. But just even having to go up that smart switch was getting too hard. So now we had to introduce things like Alexa and Google, so we could just say, "Hey, turn off the lights." And then we started bringing in cameras and doorbells and locks and gas monitors and smart blinds. Like, it just keeps going and going. And this is exactly how we have to approach a building. But we have to do it in a different light. And I'm going to give an example of what changed my life. And one of the things that changed my life the most is doorbell when it comes to digital. I bought the very doorbell that you see on the screen here for my house. And I bought it because my daughter was having friends over, and we would be at the back of the house, and the friends would come over, and we'd be standing there for 10, 15 minutes before we realized they were there. Or we'd be sitting in, somebody from our family would have to sit there, wait for these people to come over, so they weren't part of what was happening in the back. So we thought, okay, there's got to be a way to get past this. So we added this doorbell. So then the doorbell goes in the very next day, just after 4 o'clock. My phone rings. I'm at a customer site, and I excuse myself because I had to check out this new technology. And it was my daughter, and she called to say she was just getting home from school, and she wanted to say hi. And I hung up the phone, and the few people I was with, I was choked up because I got caught with something I didn't foresee, which was this doorbell that I bought to just tell us that people were at the front door or in the backyard, now allowed me to find out that my daughter got home safely from school. And then once COVID hit, when we started doing the Amazon purchases and stuff, well, now we had a security camera that was tracking like when that package got delivered, and it really completely changed the purpose of what we bought it for. And that's digital. When you go into it, you can't take that a direct approach. You have to be very open-minded because there's always different applications. What we're used to is building automation systems. Like they've done a fantastic job, and they've been growing and developing. But when you start looking at what you can gain with digital, it's a whole lot more information. And this is where it becomes really, really overwhelming, and where people just kind of stop because they don't know where to start. Like, what's my best solution? Everyone's coming at me. There's 50 companies in Canada alone that are offering digital solutions. So it's like, which one do I go to? Which one is the best one? That's that's the hardest part, and it's very much like when building automation came out. It was very, very hard for people to figure out, where do I start. When you compare building automation systems, general system, to a digital system, when you're bringing in data, a lot of the same protocols exist, with the biggest difference being the hardware. The hardware is a fraction of the cost, but all of a sudden you can bring in a lot more points. And that's because it's not doing any process in the hardware. Like within a typical digital panel, for instance, you're doing programming, you're doing scheduling, all that sort of stuff can reside within there. So it takes a lot more capacity of the actual component, where this is just, it's the data ingestion, and the actual math happens up in the cloud. That proprietary means, like, as much as everyone's saying, like, okay, this is my own, like, we're open everything. The reality is, if you have a program within this solution, that company's the only one that can write that program. Where when you're looking at digital, it's just an ingestion of points. So as long as that point comes up, if I'm looking for a backnet point, I'm just looking to analyze the point and see what it's doing. I could care less where it's from. So it really becomes much truly that agnostic nature. When you follow how the technology is affecting points and everything, it's becoming pretty dramatic. So if you look at the dark blue as the physical point, so we add the physical point, then maybe we add, like, if we track it like an alarm, so we add this point, we can add an alarm, and then we can add enhanced alarms. So that's our core solution. That's what we've been doing for years. But now we want to get into more information. So it's like, well, when that alarm comes in, what if I add fault detection? What if I add uh, analytics and stuff like that to it? And then what if I put a monetization value to it? Now I know exactly where to focus, what's going to have the biggest impact on my overall operational budget and the operation of my facility. But this also means that we have to do things a little bit differently. Like the traditional fare is, if we wanted to get to the data, we would basically all go through one system. And that's just where technology took it. It was the smartest integrator within the facility. So everyone would take their systems and put them through this automation system. Well, what's happened is, like, the automation, a lot of the components are not cheap, and there's a lot of legacy systems. So if you start to pull all these systems through the one system, it gets really, really tough. There's a lot of challenges that come out, so it becomes a bit of a bottleneck. So as much as it was the latest and greatest, it's become a little bit of an archaic means of looking at things. So now if we want to pull data, ideally, what we want to do is we want to pull it straight up to an edge collector, and then that edge collector can actually be the transitional device. So if we want to pull up, let's say, how many people are in my elevator, I can bring that right into this edge collector. I don't have to go through the automation system. Or same thing with lighting. If I want to bring my occupancy sensors up into here, and then I have the ability to actually push some of that information back down to other systems from these collectors as well. So it's making it a bit more of a sustainable, longer term approach, because we're not dependent on any one system. Like, if that system goes down, we're not in the dark for data for the rest of the systems. And now when you start looking, like, there's so many different ways to bring information in. Like, there's a lot of physical different ways. There's a lot of soft ways. And as a result of those, we're able to start doing things very, very simply in metrics and clouds that we couldn't before. Like, when we want to start looking at, let's say we're looking at energy. So we want to look at the energy consumption today, and we say, okay, well, how does that compare to this exact same day a year ago? Well, the one challenge has always been weather. Well, if we have the weather information and it's tied in, we can do normalization right off the bat. Nobody has to do any calculations. We can get those metrics. And the way that we pull information in is changing dramatically. Like, we don't need to basically go to any one spot. So as much as we can go through an automation system, in some cases, we can go right to the utility, right to the cloud. We can create virtual meters. We have the ability to, anything that's smart on its own can go right up into these various sources. But we also have to be cognizant of how much data are we pulling, and do we need it all? with anything new, you always want everything. And then when you start to realize, if I'm pulling 25 points from an air handler, I probably only need 5. And if I pull the 25 points and I have 15 air handlers, that's pretty taxing on my automation system. So we've got to be very considerate as to, what can these systems handle, and what's my overall IT infrastructure for a successful digital project. IT has to be involved from the get-go, because it's like, what's your bandwidth? What do you have? In fact, it's probably the first go-to as a whole, because we have to avoid the sloth. Like, really pedigree falcons and cheetahs here are where we need to pull a lot of metadata. Like, pulling a lot of data through a sloth is not a good idea on any stretch. Even when we look at central utility plants and the way we applied it, how we are now applying technology, the traditional chiller plant optimization, it brought in the weather. So you basically say, as the weather's, let's say it's going to be hot this afternoon, let's pre-cool the building, so you'd adjust your chillers, cooling towers, and pumps to maintain that space. Nowadays, it's a whole different level. Like, we're not just looking at the chillers, we're looking at the boilers, we're looking at heat pumps, and we're looking at other predictable factors, whether it's utility rates, digital twins, everything. So it's a whole bunch of load calculations as a whole that are affecting every component that actually has an effect on the space. And it can be done autonomously, which is crazy, realistically, when you think about it. But what it does, though, is it fills in a bit of that manpower gap. As a lot of these senior people are retiring, there's a lot of junior folks that don't have the knowledge, or in some cases the want to learn to the same level that some of these folks that have been in these buildings for 40 years have learned. So we need to do things differently. So we're starting to see programs like this come out. When you look at how the data, like what people are looking at as a whole, within automation systems, within all kinds of systems, people need to see the actual picture. Like, not everyone is quite as technical as they used to be, and there's a lot more different versions of equipment. So it's getting harder for people to service things, as realistically. But as we move forward, when you start looking at these digital models, within this building information modeling and stuff, there's a lot of good things that are happening. And if it's done right, you can start to really get effective. But the reason you're not seeing a lot of this building information modeling yet, it's like less than 5% of Canada's considering it, for stats I've seen, is it's expensive. Example I like to use, the Vancouver Airport just did a building information model, and it was $4 million to replicate the airport. Not everybody has $4 million to spend on digital and then the maintenance of digital. But when you get it going, and you get it right, and there are benefits, because if you have somebody who's new, and think of the transition of people that's regularly happening, well, now somebody can go into the space and figure out, like, okay, this is the furniture, this is the height of the ceilings. I can actually look at the space and service it, but I can also make changes. So you can send stuff like this to consultants and everyone else, and get a sense of what the building looks like before you even step into the facility. And now there's new things coming out, and the new things are these digital integration teams. There's a Department of National Defense, National Capital Commission, and there's some other ones that are all using these terms. And what they're basically saying is they're starting to realize that they don't have the expertise in house. So they want to have these teams and these people in place. So when we look at that, it's like, okay, so all of a sudden somebody has to maintain all this data and all these hard points and all the communications, but then somebody else has to analyze this information, put it into a format that other people can understand, and make sure that the data is clean, that there's no gaps, that everything's there. And then we get into, somebody has to take that data and say, okay, well, this is what you need to do to get to your KPI or your goal or your target. So as much as I said digital is a 4-step process, It's really a 6-step process. You have to identify what's smart. If you don't have anything smart, you can't do digital. The stuff has to be able to be ingested into the cloud. You have to include everyone. It's not just a facilities item. It's not just an IT item. It's not just for HR. It's everyone involved. Introduce the concept. That's where the 4 steps come in. Workshops. The bigger the project, the more important the workshops are. If you're as you're going through these processes, just like my doorbell example, you start to find other things that happen and other things that can be done. You need to identify use cases that match those KPIs, but then there's also going to be some things that come out that are going to potentially change the KPIs as a whole. And then you have to map that experience. Because this is what it's starting to look like. This is an actual one of the asks that are on the market right now. So it's no longer just about the building in the center. It's about connectivity, security, mass notification, digital signage. Like, how are you communicating to people what you're doing? People counting, parking. It's getting crazy. No other way to look at it. So there's a lot of things that are coming up. How are we for time? I think I'll go for just a couple more minutes. I'll just show a couple examples of what some of these reports and things look like once they're into this environment for those who haven't seen it. You can get carbon tracking, so automatically, no more doing manual calculations. Things can come in so that you can set up carbon goals and see how you're actually doing with live data. So when that monthly utility report comes in, it's automatically populated. Energy analytics. There's more in the digital world than we've ever seen in building automation, in that it's an easier view. So people who aren't technical that want to look at the data aren't completely dependent on facilities to giving them information. You can get into heat mapping. You can look at things, as I mentioned, like normalized values. There's a bunch of different ways to see things. You can get notifications. So as you said, baselines. You can say, okay, if I hit a certain threshold, let me know that day within 15 minutes. I don't want to find out at the end of the month that, hey, we've been losing water for the last 30 days and our water bill is 3 times what it was the previous month. Fault detection. The difference between a fault and an alarm is a fault is a deviation from where you want to be. So if we're looking for 22 degrees and we're at 22.9 degrees, that's a fault. An alarm would be if we're at 25 degrees. But at 22.9 degrees, the question becomes, like, why aren't we coming back to 22? Like, what's causing that issue? And when we start to take all that data and we bring that information back, well, then we can start categorizing that data into sectors, like whether it's comfort, energy, all this, and that information, and basically start helping our operations team figure out where to focus their day, what's going to give us our biggest impacts. This stuff can be integrated with CMMS systems as a whole. So maintenance management systems can ingest some of this data with various applications. So it's not just a duplication, it can be a complement to existing solutions. The reports, we're into a whole different level than what we see with BMS, the traditional little line drawings and stuff that we see out of the BMS system. Now we're into Power BI, like it's getting, and these reports can be generated automatically, daily, weekly, monthly, so people don't even have to go into the system. They just get an email with all the data that they've been looking for and wanting for ages. When you look at space, like we're looking at it into a whole different level. Like we can do the same analytics that we do for energy within space, people counters, motion sensors, occupancy sensors, all that sort of stuff. But then we can also bring in indoor air quality and start looking at that aspect. When you look at that asset management, as I mentioned before, if we consider where the faults and stuff lie, it can also help us decide, okay, well, as much as I may be at light for this piece of equipment, is it the right time to change it? Because it looks like I have other problems with other systems. So that asset management aspect comes through. Well, probably the biggest change is the employee experience. It's the one thing that has changed the most. We're empowering employees to change their own space. When they walk into the space, there's tools available that they can say, okay, I'm here And now I can control my lights. I can control my blinds. I don't have to make a phone call. And that is my time.
That's awesome. Thanks, Paul. I got a question for you, actually. So earlier on in the presentation, you were talking about there being a dizzying number of companies working in the digital world in Canada alone.
Yeah.
You said over 50 in the space. I guess my question to you is, that represents a whole lot of use cases. It represents a whole lot of, instruments and data collection vehicles and what have you. Where does somebody start in trying to map out what they want or need for their building?
I'm not going to lie. Johnson Controls is a great place to start. No. Realistically, you have to start with your use cases. Everyone goes, it tends to be this, I'll say, direction where you're looking at, okay, what's the solution? And then how do I bring the solution in? And then the first thing that solution asks is, how do you want me to apply this? Or we're going to give you our package and you're going to get a bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily need or want. So it really comes down to, what are you trying to do? So give an example. You want to add people counters to your washrooms. So what are those people counters going to do? The people counters are going to tell us how many people have used the washroom. So now you can notify the cleaners to go clean that washroom. But it's also going to tell us how many people are usually using that washroom and how many people use the washrooms closest to where they are. So now you can get the metrics and say, okay, well, why aren't people using the washrooms on the third floor? Why are they only in the fourth floor? So now you can start to see where people are migrating within the building. And slowly but surely you build it up that way. With all the companies, the reason there's so many companies is digital is a global solution. It's not like the agnostic, like it's BACnet, Modbus, all those points. It's not like you're centric to any one spot. But probably the biggest thing that's kind of changing, that also brings a 50 down to probably 10, is data residency. So not everybody can say, okay, all my data resides in Canada, and that's starting to be a huge customer request. And it's something I would encourage you and everyone on the call to have that conversation early. Like, where does your data have to reside? Because you start going down the path to find out that the data resides in the States, in Europe, in Australia, whatever the case, and all of a sudden that company's not somebody you can use. But it really for the customers and stuff that we talk to regularly, they're talking to 4 or 5 different digital suppliers before they come up with and say, okay, this is a solution I want to go with as a whole. Yeah, and we're seeing a lot more RFSQs and RFIs than I've ever seen in the history of, like, typically it might be RFQ and then right into RFP. The RFIs, RFSQs are like crazy popular right now.
Yeah, you're not wrong on data residency. It certainly gives me heartburn when I think about it. All of the widgets and all of the platforms and all of the services. We when you're in the FM world and you're looking at that, they're all dollar signs. They're all like little micro contracts that you have to maintain, service contracts to access your data. So even before you talk about where the heck the data lives, what jurisdiction it lives in and who might have access to it, you also have the stress of creating a whole new T account that is service contracts.
Yeah, it's really, and it's tough. Like I mentioned a lot of these sustainability folks that are on, like they have a hard role. Like they're coming in the company saying, like, okay, get me to net zero, and a lot of them are not technical by nature. So they go in, they want the data, and then they can't figure out why they can't get the data. And then you look into it, and 3/4 of the floor is pneumatic, for instance, that they're looking at, and it's like, oh, geez, so you're telling me I can't get data from that, or it's all localized control, and like I can't get. Well, what do I have to do? Meters. Technology has to be installed, and they go, well, we don't have any money for that, and it's a bit of a quandary. So it's
talking about legacy. Talking about legacy systems, right?
Yeah, cart and the horse again.
Legacy is more than just the programming or the software. Legacy also is the hardware. So that's quite interesting. You also talked earlier about you recognized that this space is is growing and adapting rapidly, and that perhaps those folks working in sustainability and the consultants, the design teams, are having to digest and learn and adapt very, very quickly. I was wondering if from your perspective, if you have any insight on perhaps where the industry needs to go in terms of learning, training, building capacity, so that we can walk clients through a journey map exercise, right, to determine what those use cases of interest are.
So if I was to go way back in this presentation here, it'll be faster if I. There's one slide I had that basically said like what's in the building, and that is key. It, you don't want to find out on step 25 that you just don't have all the smart components to ingest, and it's we're so far back here, some of the slides. But when you start looking at right there, we don't know what we don't know until we know what we do know, which is what's smart. And once we start with what's smart, the very first thing, just like if you're doing an energy project, you need metering. You need to load calculations, all that stuff. In the digital world, we need live meters because that's where base loads and everything come in. And the number of folks across Canada who don't have meters that you can ingest data from, they're all standalone. It's completely stagnating projects because it is the core portion of where the data starts. So it's not just that initial utility meter, but then you need some sub meters like the loading meters, that sort of stuff. So, which is presenting another challenge. If you look back at COVID, if you wanted to get to Y2K, Y2K, not COVID. If you wanted to get to Y2K, everybody could buy a computer in January and easily meet Y2K requirements with that new computer. Come December, it was 5 times the price, but you could put it in on December 31st, slap your computer in, and you met Y2K. When it comes to meters, a lot of folks across Canada are trying to reduce carbon, trying to meet 2030, and a lot of them have more aggressive goals. Like we're seeing a lot of 2025s, 2027s, but they don't have any meters. And nobody's really getting to carbon neutral or net zero without metering. And right now, it's like without those meters in place, they're competing with the entire world, just like Y2K. Except the difference is those meters could be 5, 10, 15,000 bucks to put in, and somebody has to put them in. We have a labor shortage. So if they're not ordering them now and they're not doing them now, they're openly saying, I don't want to meet my targets. But it's hard for an owner to hear that. What they're like, well, there must be some other way. And nobody wants to say to an owner, I don't want to work with you because you don't want to buy the right stuff. But the reality is, if they don't get the right stuff, it's going to be very hard to get there. Mm-hmm. So first part, it's like metering. You want to become meter experts. Like, how do I look at that data? How do I make the calculations? Second part, you have to become like a MC at a wedding. You have to be able to talk to a bunch of different people because there's different KPIs that we're not used to. Everyone's used to occupancy health indexes, like how happy are people. So there's somebody that enters a room now that we're not typically used to having in the room. That's HR, because we're trying to satisfy that employee measure and stuff like that. So just kind of think of when you walk through the workplace, when you walk into a space, what are you looking for, and how many people would affect what's happening there? And that's really how you want to approach this. So it's a bit of a different approach as a whole, but it's one that I think is really in need, but it's going to make a difference. Your first project is going to be your hardest, no question. You're going to trip, you're going to fall, you may even fail, but don't think it's the end of the world because everyone's going through the exact same thing. Like it's just what we like I showed some carbon slides of metrics and stuff. That stuff didn't exist in our world a year ago. Like it was all done by hand. Like it's changing that quickly. Like and the faster things go, the worse it's going to get. So what I'd say to you is, if you're not comfortable, if you're still struggling as an engineer with BACnet, Modbus, all that sort of stuff, you need to understand it. Like it's the D-Day is here. You are going to be left behind if you don't understand the integration protocols and what information I should be gathering versus my use case.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what I'm hearing from you, and what I think I understood before we even started this conversation, was that the soft skills and facilitation, that facilitation skill set is going to become increasingly important in the digital transformation. And frankly, that's not something engineers and technical people are traditionally good at, right? So that's a new tool for us to add to our toolbox.
Absolutely. Like as engineers, you are now the MC at the wedding.
Yeah.
Like that's really what your role is becoming. Like you have to, you may not be the integration specialist, but you have to understand what they're doing, why they're bringing those points in. You have to understand what the overall effect is going to be on the output and who's going to look at it and then put it all together. So you're looking at the bride, the groom, the two different sets of parents, and all the people coming in and making sure that that wedding goes without a hitch.
Yeah, right on. I have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up, and it's related to value and perhaps selling the digital transformation in terms of what a company can expect to see in terms of payback. Engineers are especially in the energy world, are very well versed in this conversation of payback. What the heck is payback? And we're transitioning towards life cycle costing to justify expenditures. But beyond energy savings, what are you guys bringing into the value conversation when you're talking about this with your clients?
So it's great that you brought that question up, because that's actually ROI on digital is one of the hardest things to calculate without question. So if you think of energy, you take a facility improvement measure and you're going to put your lights in, you can just quickly do the calculations based on the number of fixtures. When you look at what digital is doing, we're sourcing information in different facets. A recent conversation I had with a facility manager, we showed them the digital solution, we went through stuff, and I said, what'd you think? And he said, well, I think that if we put this in, you're going to save me 2 to 3 days a month of reports that I don't have to do. Because now the people like CFOs and people that I'm reporting to can just pull this data out themselves. The other thing that is, I'll say overall operational wise, is when you start looking at things like ASHI, lead reporting, all this sort of stuff, that's got to be continuous. Like there's a lot of people that are spending a lot of time doing this. Or sustainability reports. Take a look at the date of sustainability reports. They usually come out in March, May, halfway through the fiscal period for customers. This allows them to actually bring the data up forward. So now they're not starting the sustainability plan halfway through their fiscal year. They're starting at the beginning of the year in the first 2 months or something like that. So it has that operational effect, but it's very hard to put a number to it. And customers are going to be hesitant to say, okay, well, how much are you being paid and how much time do you spend on this particular event? And that's your ROI. So it becomes and that's why it's like that four-step process that I was saying, is you have to get them to recognize their pain versus the overall effect of introducing a different way of looking at information.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Paul, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today. I think it goes without saying that this particular topic is one that's going to evolve tremendously over the next handful of years, and it should be an interesting ride. So, again, thanks so much for your time, for the story that you wove, and for the conversation that followed. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Take care.
All right. Cheers.